The air left my lungs, so fast it felt like someone had driven a fist straight through my ribs. My fingertips went cold against the polished mahogany edge of the conference table, and for one strange second all I could hear was the sharp hum of fluorescent lighting above us and the dry whisper of presentation packets being pushed across lacquered wood. My mother sat at the head of the table in a cream silk blouse and a blazer the color of wet slate, one hand resting lightly on a leather folder, the other curled around the stem of a water glass. She was smiling. My sister Celeste stood to her right in high heels that struck the stone floor like a metronome, one manicured hand flat against the back of an empty chair, chin lifted, eyes bright with the kind of excitement people get right before they watch somebody burn. Mark Halpern, our CFO, wouldn't look directly at me. He kept adjusting his cuff links, swallowing too often, the blue vein in his temple jumping. Across from him, Dana Ruiz from HR pressed her lips together, so tightly they disappeared, while two outside board members shifted in their leather seats and pretended not to notice that I had just become the entertainment. Then my mother laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a surprised laugh, a soft, polished, social laugh, the kind she used at charity galas when someone said something mildly absurd. "Nora," she said, lifting one of the packets with two fingers as if it were dirty. "Did you really think we wouldn't find out?" She slid the packet toward me. On top was a stack of printed bank transfers, highlighted in yellow. Vendor payments routed through a Shell Consulting account. My name typed neatly in the recipient field. My signature block copied at the bottom of an internal authorization email. Beneath it, a spreadsheet showing client migration projections from my division to an outside firm in Milwaukee. Stolen data. Fraud. Sabotage. The words were all there, sitting in 12-point font on bright white paper under conference room lighting, so harsh it made everyone look a little dead. Celeste folded her arms and leaned one hip against the table. "You've been taking from the company for months," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And after everything Mom has done for you. My name is Nora Whitfield. I'm 31. And this is the story of how my mother handed my life to my sister in front of a boardroom full of witnesses, and how I took it all back with the truth." The room smelled faintly of coffee, toner, and the peony Celeste had insisted on placing in a blown glass vase near the screen because she thought every serious room needed something feminine in it. Outside the windows, late afternoon rain glazed the Chicago skyline in silver. Inside, my mother lifted her glass and took a small, composed sip, like this was all a regrettable but necessary piece of business. "You always were emotional under pressure," she said, "which is why this had to happen formally." I looked down at the packet. The signature on the printed email was mine. The formatting was close enough to fool anyone who didn't know how obsessively I built my templates. The transfers were real numbers attached to fake context. Clean work, if you didn't know where to look. Celeste leaned in and planted both palms on the table. Her rings clicked against the wood. "Say something." Mark cleared his throat. "The board has already reviewed the preliminary findings." Dana finally looked up. "Given the severity of the misconduct, termination for cause is being recommended immediately." One of the outside directors, Thomas Weller, rubbed the side of his neck. "There's also the succession matter," he muttered, as if he hated being part of the sentence. That was when my mother opened the leather folder. Inside was a single-page resolution transferring operational control of Whitfield and Vale Interiors to Celeste effective immediately, with an additional recommendation that the family trust vote in favor of her expanded equity package. The company my father built, the expansion model I designed, the vendor restructuring plan I spent 3 years creating, all of it placed in front of my sister with one elegant motion. My mother looked at me over the top of the page and smiled again. "Celeste earned everything," she said. "You were given every opportunity, Nora. She built loyalty. She built relationships. She understood sacrifice. You just assumed your work spoke for itself." The words landed with a chill, so clean it almost steadied me. Because there it was. Not just the accusation. Not just the theft. The belief underneath it. The thing that had been true in our house for as long as I could remember. Celeste shone and I produced. Celeste charmed and I repaired. Celeste was the face in the room. I was the hands under the table keeping the structure from collapsing. When we were children, my mother used to tell guests that Celeste could talk the leaves off trees, then point at me and say, with a fond little shrug. Nora reads the instruction manual. Everybody would laugh, including me, back then. I didn't understand that sometimes the role your family assigns you becomes the cage they expect you to die in. Celeste pulled out the chair beside her and sat with one ankle crossed over the other, victorious already. I told you this would catch up to you. I lifted the first page again, slowly. My mother mistook the silence for weakness. I could tell because her shoulders relaxed. She set her glass down. Mark exhaled through his nose. Dana uncapped a pen, ready to document my collapse. Turn in your laptop and access badge before you leave, my mother said. If you cooperate, I may be able to prevent criminal charges. I looked at her, then at Celeste, and because I have always understood timing better than either of them, I let the silence settle over the room until it became a physical thing. Until everyone at that table became aware, on some instinctive level, that I was not reacting correctly. I placed the packet back down, smoothed the corner with my thumb, reached for my water, took one small sip, and said very evenly, "Then let's talk about what she earned." You could feel the room tighten. Celeste's smile flickered first, barely, a tiny tightening at the corners of her mouth. My mother's fingers stopped moving on the folder. Mark's head lifted. "Nora," my mother said, warning in her voice now. I opened my own bag and took out a slim black flash drive. 6 weeks earlier, at 11:43 on a Tuesday night, Celeste had broken into my office with Mark's help and copied the contents of my restricted project folder. I knew the exact time because the canary file I planted inside had sent a silent ping to a secure server the moment someone opened it. The fake spreadsheet they'd printed this afternoon was built from that folder. The transfer trail they thought buried me was one I had followed all the way back to a holding company in Naperville registered to Grant Mercer, Celeste's boyfriend, who also happened to consult for 3 of our vendors. And the forged email authorization they were so proud of had been created from a duplicate of my signature block that still carried the wrong font kerning on the footer. I rose from my chair, walked to the wall screen, and plugged in the drive. Slowly, Celeste stood up too fast, the chair legs scraping hard against stone. "What are you doing?" "Finishing the meeting," I said. The first image appeared on the screen, a metadata panel. File origin, device ID, user path, creation timestamp. "This spreadsheet," I said, touching the remote with my thumb, "was not created in my restricted folder. It was exported from Celeste's laptop at 6:12 this morning, after being opened from a mirrored archive on Mark Halpern's credentials." Mark went white in a way I had only seen once before, when an investor asked him an unscripted question during our 2022 restructuring call. He half stood, then sat back down so abruptly the leather chair gave a small gasp beneath him. "That proves nothing," Celeste snapped. "We were reviewing evidence." I clicked again. Up came the login trail. Celeste's keycard entry to my office after midnight. Mark's credentialed access to a restricted drive he had no authorization to enter. Dana frowned now, pen frozen midair. "You reviewed a file you stole," I said calmly. "That's Revelation 1. My mother rose. "Not fully. Just enough to show she wanted the movement. Turn that off." I clicked again. A split screen appeared. On the left, the vendor transfer my packet allegedly showed as fraud. On the right, the full ledger entry. Same transaction number. Same date. But now the missing columns were visible. Reimbursement. Internal recovery. Test audit marker. Authorized as part of an internal trace program approved by outside counsel. Thomas Weller leaned forward, so quickly his glasses slipped down his nose. "The payments you highlighted," I said, "were not stolen. They were bait." Each transfer was linked to one of 3 ghost vendors that have been overbilling Whitfield and Vale for 14 months. Those vendors all route back to Mercer Strategic Holdings. I looked directly at Celeste. "Grant's company." Her mouth opened, then shut. Mark made a strangled sound. "That's absurd." I clicked again. Articles of incorporation. Mercer Strategic Holdings. Registered address. Shared mailing suite with Bellcrest Procurement, Artisan Freight Review, and Northline Vendor Solutions. All 3 companies had submitted invoices to us. All 3 had received accelerated payment under Celeste's signature authority. All 3 had one person in common besides Grant Mercer. Mark Halpern. "That's Revelation 2, I said. The silence that followed was absolute. It broke when Celeste slapped one palm against the table. "Mom, stop her." My mother didn't move. For the first time since I'd walked into that room, she looked less angry than uncertain. It was subtle, a slight narrowing around her eyes, a single measured breath. She was recalculating in real time, trying to determine what exactly I knew. So I gave her the answer. I clicked again. An audio file appeared on the screen. Mark lunged to his feet. "You can't just..." I pressed play. There was some static first, the rustle of fabric, a door closing, then my mother's voice, unmistakable in its smooth, low register. "If she asks about the invoices again, we move faster." Celeste answered, sharper, impatient. "Then we do the board packet Friday, blame the client attrition on her, and transfer succession before she can slow anything down." My mother again. "Good. Once control is settled, she won't have the leverage." Celeste laughed softly. She never had leverage. She had spreadsheets. I paused the audio. Nobody in that room seemed to be breathing normally anymore. Dana's face had gone the color of paper. Thomas stared at the screen. One of the outside directors whispered, "Jesus Christ," to no one in particular. My mother's voice, when it came, was cold and flat. "Where did you get that?" I set the remote down beside the screen. "That's Revelation 3. Celeste took one step toward me. "You recorded us." "No," I said. "Someone you trusted did?" Her pupils widened. It happened so fast most people would have missed it, but panic always announces itself in the eyes first. Mark found his voice before she did. "This is illegally obtained. This entire presentation is compromised." "Actually," I said, turning toward him, "outside counsel advised the trace program, the audit markers, and the preservation protocol after I reported suspected internal fraud 3 weeks ago. Every device used to access my files after that point was lawfully logged. Every financial transfer was monitored. Every board member in this room received a litigation hold notice 22 minutes before this meeting began." I let that settle. Then I added the line that changed the temperature in the room completely. "Actually, the only theft in this building has been yours." Celeste sat down, so hard the chair rolled back an inch. Her face had lost that lacquered confidence. Without it, she looked older. Not older in years, older in damage. My mother reached for the folder in front of her as if paper could still save her. Mark pulled at his collar. Dana finally put her pen down altogether. "You planned this," my sister whispered. I looked at her. I prepared. The next 10 minutes unraveled exactly the way panic always does. Loud at first, then messy, then pathetic. Mark started talking too fast, trying to frame the vendor chain as standard consulting structure. I showed the duplicate invoice numbers. Celeste accused me of manipulating timestamps. I pulled up the cloud audit report signed by Kessler Forensic Advisory 2 days earlier. My mother attempted to end the meeting. Thomas Weller, suddenly interested in his own liability, refused to adjourn until copies were secured and independent counsel was engaged. Dana asked if she needed to contact employment counsel. One of the outside directors physically moved his chair away from Mark as though fraud might be contagious. I didn't raise my voice once. I simply advanced the slides one by one. A copy of my original market expansion deck from 18 months earlier, bearing my authorship metadata and internal version history, side by side with Celeste's vision presentation, to the board 3 weeks later. A chain of text messages between Grant and Mark coordinating invoice timing. A notarized affidavit from an outside IT consultant confirming my signature block had been cloned. A draft amendment to the Whitfield Family Trust, dated 2 months after the notary listed on it had retired. That last one hit my mother harder than the audio. Her head turned very slowly toward the folder she had carried into the room. Thomas looked at her with open disbelief. "Evelyn," he said, "is the succession amendment invalid?" She didn't answer. Celeste did. "Mom." My mother's jaw tightened. "This is not the place." "No," I said, picking up my bag. "It isn't." I unplugged the drive and slipped it into my palm. Then I looked back at the table where they had prepared to bury me and said, "Keep every document in this room exactly where it is. My attorney will want the originals." I left them there under fluorescent light and reflected glass and the sudden sour smell of fear. My heels sounded almost delicate on the stone corridor outside, while behind me voices began to rise in jagged fragments. Mark swearing, Celeste demanding answers, my mother saying, in that clipped tone she used when losing control. Lower your voice. They thought they had my career, my credibility, my inheritance. They had no idea I'd spent 6 weeks making sure the room across the street was ready for the real meeting. The next 48 hours moved with the strange, weightless speed of a storm front. Lawyers, holds, sworn statements, duplicate backups, emergency board correspondence. Everything that had once lived in shadow was dragged into procedural daylight. I slept little, not because I was afraid, but because precision requires attention, and I had no intention of letting rage make me sloppy. 3 days later, at 9 a.m., I walked into Whitmore, Keene and Alder on LaSalle Street wearing a charcoal suit, a cream blouse, and the pearl studs my father gave me when I finished graduate school. The lobby smelled like polished stone and expensive coffee. Sunlight fell through 2 stories of glass and broke into pale rectangles across the marble floor. Upstairs, the conference room assigned to us had walnut walls, bronze sconces, and leather chairs so deep they seemed designed to swallow weak men whole. Authority has its own texture. Quiet, absorbent, the kind of room where lies don't sound louder. They just sound thinner. My attorney, Julian Cross, was already there reviewing a binder tabbed in navy and gray. Julian was in his early 40s, tall, composed, with silver at the temples, and the kind of stillness that makes other people volunteer too much. Next to him sat Priya Desai, the forensic accountant we'd retained through Kessler Advisory, her dark hair clipped back, glasses low on her nose, yellow flags marking key pages in 3 separate ledgers. At the far end of the room was a digital screen loaded with our presentation timeline. Julian looked up when I entered. "You slept. Enough." He nodded once. "Good." There was no dramatic pep talk, no cinematic reassurance. That's one of the reasons I trusted him. Competence doesn't need theater. At 9:12, the door opened again. My mother entered first, but not the way she had entered boardrooms for the last 25 years. Not in command, not even close. Her posture was still excellent, her hair still immaculate, but something in her movements had narrowed. She held her handbag close to her body now, as if the room might take it from her. Celeste followed in navy silk and defensive makeup, but the difference between confidence and mimicry is obvious when you know where to look. She kept touching her necklace, kept moistening her lips, kept glancing at my face, then away. Mark came in behind them with an attorney from Feldman and Rowe and the expression of a man who had just discovered his own pulse. My mother had retained separate counsel, which told me more than any greeting could have. Celeste also had her own lawyer. The family had already started breaking at the seams. Good. Julian stood. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." No one did for a moment. That hesitation mattered to me more than anything they could have said. 3 days earlier, they had expected me to defend myself. Now they were afraid to choose the wrong chair. Eventually they sat. My mother directly across from Julian. Celeste 1 seat down. Mark at the far side near the door, like he wanted escape within reach. Julian opened the first binder. "We'll proceed efficiently. This meeting is being documented. The purpose is to present evidence supporting civil claims including fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conversion, defamation, unjust enrichment, and attempted trust manipulation, and to outline the criminal exposure that may follow if resolution is not reached today." Celeste's lawyer immediately leaned forward. "My client denies all allegations." Julian nodded. "She is free to continue doing so after she sees the timeline." Priya touched the screen, and the first slide appeared. It began 4 years earlier, 6 weeks after my father, Arthur Whitfield, died of a sudden aortic dissection at the age of 62. The date sat there in stark black font. October 14th. On the left side of the screen was the structure my father actually left behind. Equal beneficial interests in the Whitfield family trust for both daughters, temporary executive authority to my mother for 18 months, and a conversion clause tied to performance metrics if the company expanded into commercial design services. On the right side was what had happened instead. November 2nd. My operational expansion memo, drafted by me, circulated internally without attribution. December 9th. Celeste presents a new strategic vision to the board using my language nearly verbatim. March 4th. Mark approves first accelerated payments to Bellcrest Procurement. June 18th. First ghost vendor invoice processed. August 1st. Succession review extended due to market instability. January 12th, 2 years later, my signature block cloned. May 6th, outside client proposal I authored delivered under Celeste's name. August 29th, draft trust amendment created. 3 months ago, Grant Mercer Incorporated Mercer Strategic Holdings. 6 weeks ago, unauthorized access to my restricted file archive. Last Tuesday, board packet prepared accusing me of fraud. Priya advanced slide after slide with the gentle, devastating cadence of someone laying silverware out before an execution. Here, she said, indicating the screen with a capped pen, are the duplicate invoice numbers. Same formatting errors. Same submission times. Different vendor names. Here are the payments routed through Mercer Strategic Holdings and reclassified as client acquisition costs. Here are reimbursements authorized by Ms. Whitfield, Celeste, 43 times in 11 months. Here are the matching deposits into accounts connected to Mr. Mercer. And here, another click, is the extraction log showing Ms. Nora Whitfield's restricted file access originating from Mr. Halpern's credentials at 11:43 p.m. on March 18th. Mark's lawyer put a hand on his arm when Mark started to speak. "Not yet," he murmured. Julian let the quiet work for him. Then he said, "We also have testimony." The door opened, and Lila Moreno walked in. For a second, Celeste looked like she'd forgotten how chairs worked. Her spine stiffened so fast it seemed to lock. Lila! Lila had been Celeste's executive assistant for 3 years. 28, precise, understated, always in clean lines and sensible heels, always carrying 2 phones and a notebook. Celeste used to describe her as loyal in the way people describe appliances. Useful, reliable, invisible, which was part of why Celeste never noticed when Lila stopped admiring her and started observing her. Lila sat at the side table, folded her hands, and met Julian's nod. "You provided an affidavit?" he asked. "I have. Would you like to summarize the reason?" Lila's voice was clear and steady. 3 months ago, Miss Celeste Whitfield asked me to backdate board scheduling records and resend an archive draft from Ms. Nora Whitfield's folder without attribution. 2 weeks later, she instructed me to print vendor packets I believed had been altered. When I expressed concern, she told me not to be dramatic. Last month, Mr. Halpern asked to borrow my login credentials to clean up duplication issues in the accounts payable archive. I refused. 2 days later, I learned my credentials had been used anyway. At that point, I began documenting everything. Celeste stared at her as if the wrong stranger had walked into the room. "You were my assistant," she said softly. Lila turned to her. "Exactly. There are many reasons people switch sides. Money, fear, guilt, ambition." With Lila, it was insult. Celeste had tried to use Lila's credentials to cover a document trail that could have destroyed her career. Then she offered her a small bonus and expected gratitude. Some betrayals happen because someone sees the light. Others happen because someone finally sees the math. Julian placed Lila's affidavit on the table and slid copies toward counsel. "There is also a second witness," he said. "This one hurt my mother more." Judith Pike entered next. Judith had been my father's estate paralegal for 12 years. 64, elegant in the uncompromising way of women who no longer seek permission to be exact, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and a tan leather portfolio under her arm. My mother trusted Judith because Judith had handled family paperwork for years. What my mother forgot is that some professionals are loyal to the work, not the people trying to bend it. Judith opened her portfolio and removed 2 documents. "The trust amendment presented by Mrs. Evelyn Whitfield at the March board meeting," she said, setting the first copy down, "contains a notarization date of August 29th. The notary named on that document retired permanently on July 31st and surrendered her seal to the county clerk. In addition, Arthur Whitfield's original trust expressly prohibited unilateral reallocation of beneficial interests by the temporary executive trustee. Any amendment of that scale required either both beneficiaries' written consent or a court petition. My mother's lawyer closed his eyes for half a second. Celeste looked from Judith to my mother. "Mom." My mother's face did not change. That was one of the things she had taught me. Actually, never let a room see you bleed first. But I saw the small pulse beating hard at the hinge of her jaw. Julian folded his hands. To summarize, Mrs. Whitfield attempted to enforce an invalid trust amendment while Miss Celeste Whitfield and Mr. Mark Halpern facilitated a fraud scheme involving ghost vendors, file theft, and a fabricated board accusation intended to remove Ms. Nora Whitfield from operational authority and discredit any challenge. Mark's lawyer spoke first, quick and brittle. My client disputes the characterization of intent. Priya clicked to the next slide. Text messages appeared. Grant, we move her out Friday, right? Mark, after packet. Evelyn wants clean vote. Grant, Celeste says one sister's out. There's nobody left checking line items. Another message, 2 weeks later. Celeste, use Nora's templates. She notices fonts. Mark, not if she's busy defending herself. No one spoke. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the faint hiss of the air vent above the window. Outside, downtown traffic moved 20 floors below like a silent current. Inside, every lie was laid out flat under warm conference lighting, stripped of style. My mother finally turned to Celeste. Did you put that in writing? The question was so surgically selfish that even Celeste blinked. You're asking me that now. I'm asking, my mother said. Each word clipped. Whether you are incapable of basic discretion. Celeste laughed once. It came out cracked, like glass under pressure. That's unbelievable. This was your plan. You told me she had to go. Because you told me she was undermining the company. She was asking questions. Because the numbers were wrong. Mark suddenly spoke over both of them. With respect, Mrs. Whitfield approved every vendor acceleration. My mother turned on him with a look sharp enough to cut paper. You assured me they were legitimate. You signed without reading. You told me there was no exposure. Celeste shoved her chair back. Are you both insane? We are not doing this. Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Please continue if you'd like. The dynamic is clarifying. That almost made me smile. The fracturing happened fast after that. My mother demanded to confer privately with counsel. Celeste demanded to know what Grant had said. Mark demanded indemnification. Celeste's attorney requested a pause. My mother's attorney asked to review the trust issue separately. Mark's counsel whispered something urgent about criminal referral. Nobody said the word family anymore. That part had burned off in the first 10 minutes. I sat very still and watched. Not with delight. Not exactly. More with the calm of someone seeing a building reveal its real architecture after the facade drops away. This was what had always been underneath. Entitlement. Vanity. Administrative cowardice. Celeste had charisma. My mother had authority. Mark had access. Grant had appetite. And all of them mistook my silence for dependence. They thought the person doing the work was the least dangerous person in the room. At one point, Celeste turned to me with wet fury in her eyes and said, How long? Julian glanced at me. I answered myself. I started verifying invoice patterns 3 months ago, I said. I knew you were in my file 6 weeks ago. I knew about the trust draft the day Judith called. And I knew you'd staged the accusation when you pulled Dana into the packet meeting without copying me. Celeste stared. You let it happen. I wanted you to see them, I said quietly. It took her a second to understand what I meant. Not just the board, not just the lawyers. The whole shape of it. The greed. The theft. The plan. I wanted it visible. I wanted it documented. I wanted every person who still thought Celeste was simply ambitious, and my mother was simply strict to watch the two of them choose exposure over honesty. My mother's hand tightened around her pen. You were willing to damage the company. No, I replied. You were. I just made sure there was a record. Julian slid a settlement packet across the table. It was thick. Inside was everything that mattered. Immediate resignation of Mark Halpern for cause. Celeste's surrender of any fraud-linked compensation and suspension of equity transfer claims pending formal trust restoration. My mother's agreement to step down from unilateral executive control and consent to appointment of an independent interim board chair. A public correction to the board record retracting the accusations against me. Restitution tied to the ghost vendor payments. Full cooperation with forensic review. Preservation of all devices. And perhaps most important of all, a conditional standstill provision on criminal referrals that would remain in place only if they complied completely and truthfully. Julian rested one hand lightly on the packet. If these terms are rejected, my client is prepared to proceed with civil filings this afternoon and submit the evidentiary package to the state's attorney and the probate court. Given the trust issue, the document manipulation, and the financial routing. I do not recommend delay. Mark's lawyer spoke first. We'll need revisions. You'll need realism, Julian said. Priya passed another sheet down the table. For clarity, the current financial exposure excluding punitive claims is estimated at $3.8 million. Mark went gray again. Celeste whispered, Grant told me it was temporary. Priya looked at her without expression. Fraud often introduces itself that way. The next 2 hours were negotiation in the purest sense. Not dramatic. Precise. Brutal in its own clean way. My mother tried to preserve status. Julian cut away language until only compliance mattered. Celeste tried to separate herself from the vendor scheme. Priya walked her through signed approvals 1 month at a time. Mark tried to paint himself as administrative, not strategic. Lila's affidavit contradicted him in 4 separate places. At 11:17, Celeste asked for another private conference with counsel and emerged visibly shaken, mascara beginning to gather at the corners of her eyes despite her efforts. At 11:42, my mother asked whether the public correction could be narrowly tailored. Julian said no. At 12:05, Mark asked whether resignation could be framed as transition. Julian said absolutely not. At 12:18, Celeste looked at me and said, with raw hatred stripped of all polish, you set me up. It would have been easy to answer cruelly. Instead, I said, I made sure you'd find exactly what I wanted you to find. The room went still again, because that was the line. The one that finally forced them to understand the scale of my patience. The fake files, the audit markers, the staged reimbursements, the visible bait, the preserved trails. Celeste hadn't discovered evidence against me. She had walked into a corridor I lit for her, taking each step with the confidence of someone too privileged to imagine consequences. Mark swore under his breath. I looked at him. Next time, make sure the woman printing your packets isn't also forwarding them to me. Lila didn't smile, but I saw the faintest shift in her shoulders. At 12:31, the first signature went down. Mark. His lawyer had finally done the arithmetic and realized bravado was more expensive than surrender. His hand shook enough that he had to steady the page with his other palm. The scratch of the pen across paper sounded louder than it should have. At 12:38, Celeste signed. She stared at the page for a long time before she did it. I think that was the moment denial stopped protecting her. She signed with the same elegant loop she used on holiday cards and launch invitations and vanity magazine profiles. But there was no audience here to reward beauty, just paper accepting truth. My mother signed last. Of course she did. She read every page, adjusted the stack twice, removed her glasses, put them back on. Her attorney said almost nothing by then. There was very little left to say. When she finally signed, her face remained composed, but I knew that expression. It was the one she wore at my father's funeral when all the casseroles arrived and strangers kept telling her how strong she was. It wasn't strength. It was containment. Julian gathered the documents, checked each signature, and placed them into a fresh folder. Thank you, he said. We'll circulate countersigned copies by 5. Nobody moved. Then Celeste looked at me and tried one last time to reach for the old dynamic, the one where she wounded and I absorbed. You really think this makes you better than us? I picked up my bag. No, I said. Just harder to steal from. I stood, smoothed my jacket, looked at my mother, not unkindly, but without softness either. When you told me she earned everything, I said, you were right about one part. My mother's eyes lifted to mine. She earned the consequences. Then I walked out into the bright hallway, past framed abstracts and brass sconces, and the receptionist quietly pretending she couldn't feel the temperature shift around me. In the elevator mirror, I looked exactly the same as I had 3 days earlier. Same dark hair pinned back. Same straight posture. Same face. But that's the strange thing about certain victories. They don't always change how you look. They change how much of yourself you're carrying. The next few weeks were a study in controlled demolition. The board correction went out first. Clean language. Formal tone. The accusations against me were retracted in full. An external audit had identified misconduct by certain officers and vendors. Interim governance measures were being implemented. No adjectives. No drama. Just the kind of institutional phrasing that makes catastrophe sound administrative. Within 12 days, Mark Halpern resigned publicly for cause. Industry gossip did the rest. By the end of the month, 2 firms quietly withdrew their interest in hiring him, and one of the nonprofits where he served as treasurer removed his bio from their website without announcement. Men like Mark always imagine they can survive scandal if they control the wording. They forget people can smell a forced exit the way dogs smell rain. Grant Mercer tried to fight through private counsel for about a week and a half until the full vendor trail reached him. Then he disappeared behind health reasons and an extended trip to Scottsdale. Celeste, who had once treated his attention like proof of value, was left explaining to mutual friends why his condo was suddenly on the market and why he had stopped showing up beside her at openings and fundraisers. A month later, I heard through Priya that 2 of his companies were under separate inquiry for tax irregularities. Temporary, he'd said. Like rot is temporary if you don't tap the wall. My mother stepped back from daily control of the company exactly as the agreement required, though not gracefully. She framed it publicly as a thoughtful governance transition and privately called it humiliation. But Chicago's philanthropic circles are made of polished smiles and predatory memory. Once word spread that an invalid trust amendment had been involved in the succession conflict, invitations changed tone. Some arrived later than usual. Some never came. The women who once leaned in to hear my mother's opinion at museum dinners began tilting their heads with a kind of velvet caution. Not shunning. That would have been too obvious. Just reclassification. Society knows how to punish without fingerprints. Celeste's fall was the most visible because she had built herself out of visibility. For years, she had been the Whitfield daughter photographed beside mood boards and champagne towers, all bright teeth and clean angles, quoted in local design features about intuitive leadership and family legacy. She was excellent on camera because cameras reward confidence more than character. But once the board corrections circulated and the internal restructuring became impossible to hide, the magazine call slowed. A podcast invitation quietly evaporated. A partnership with a boutique home fragrance brand paused pending review. One by one, the mirrors stopped reflecting back the woman she thought she was. She tried anger first, then revision, then nostalgia. The text began on a Sunday night at 11:08. You happy now? Then, 40 minutes later, Grant lied to all of us. Then, the next morning, Mom isn't taking this well. I archived them without responding. After that, the messages came in waves, each one wearing a different mask. Threats, pleas, half apologies shaped like accusations, memory used as currency. From Celeste, we were sisters before any of this. From my mother, the family isn't the same. From Celeste again, I miss who you used to be. That one almost made me laugh, sitting there alone at my kitchen island with morning light spreading across white stone and steam rising from my coffee in soft spirals. Because the person they missed was not a version of me lost to tragedy. She was a version of me convenient to them. 6 months later, I was living in a new apartment in Old Town with wide windows, pale oak floors, and a narrow balcony that caught the earliest slice of sun. My first morning there, I stood barefoot in an oversized knit sweater, hands wrapped around a warm ceramic mug, and watched the city wake in layers of golden gray. A delivery truck hissed to the curb below. A woman in a rust-colored coat walked a sleepy retriever past the iron fence. Somewhere down the block, someone opened a bakery door and let the smell of butter into the cold. It was one of those ordinary, perfect mornings that feel almost illegal after chaos. Stability is underrated by people who've never had to fight for it. I had not gone back to Whitfield and Vale in the way everyone expected. I retained my restored interests, joined governance decisions temporarily during transition, and then did something my mother never would have predicted. I left operational life on my own terms. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. During the investigation, Julian introduced me to 3 small business owners facing internal theft and succession disputes of their own. Priya asked if I'd ever considered advisory work. Lila, who had resigned from Celeste's orbit the week after the confrontation, had a talent for workflow mapping and documentary precision that bordered on surgical. The 3 of us began talking over coffee at a walnut table in a quiet cafe on Wells Street with green tile walls and windows fogged by winter. By spring, we had formed Alder House Advisory, governance strategy, internal risk reviews, documentation architecture, succession planning for founder-led businesses too smart to believe they were immune and too busy to know where the cracks began. We built systems for the exact kinds of blind spots that had nearly destroyed my life. Clean processes, clear authority lines, document trails that could survive ego. It turns out the skills you develop surviving a family war translate beautifully into protecting other people from theirs. Lila handled operations. Priya consulted on forensic risk. I became, to my own mild surprise, very good at sitting across from powerful people and asking quiet questions that forced honest answers. Word spread. Not loudly, not virally. The best reputations rarely do. But steadily. A hospitality group referred a founder. Then a second client came through an estate attorney. Then a third through a private equity advisor who said, with professional understatement, "You seem to understand where hidden incentives live." I did. And I understood something else now, too. Competence feels different when it belongs to you publicly. I wasn't hiding in anyone's shadow anymore. I wasn't the silent engine under another woman's brand. I signed my own proposals, led my own meetings, chose which work deserved my time. The first time a client said, "We want Nora specifically," I had to sit in my car for a full minute afterward just to feel the weight of that sentence land. Not because I doubted I deserved it, because for so long, deserving had never been the mechanism. The karma updates arrived casually, the way the best ones do. One Thursday afternoon, Lila walked into my office carrying 2 iced coffees and a look that told me she was trying not to enjoy herself too much. "You won't believe who I just saw," she said, setting my cup down. I leaned back in my chair. "Who?" "Celeste. At Restoration Hardware. Not shopping. Working." I looked at her over the rim of my glasses. Lila lifted one shoulder. "Consulting, apparently. Temporary showroom styling support." She was wearing a name tag. I took a slow sip of coffee and said, "How did she look?" Lila considered that. "Expensive. Tired. Furious that I looked calm." I nodded once. "That sounds accurate." Another update came from Julian over lunch at a place in River North with black leather banquettes and little brass lamps on the tables. "Your mother's attorney reached out again," he said, cutting into salmon. "She wants to explore reconciliation before the probate review closes." "Reconciliation," I repeated. That was the word. I smiled faintly. "How polished." He set down his fork. "There's also been movement on the social side. My mother's events." He nodded. A museum board seat opened. She wasn't asked. That one I felt more than I expected. Not because I wanted her punished in some theatrical way, but because my mother had spent years teaching us that reputation was moral proof. That if the right rooms opened for you, it meant you were worthy. Watching those rooms grow colder around her was a kind of justice she would understand in her bones. As for the enablers, each received their own proportionate bill. Dana Ruiz kept her job, but only after submitting to a review, so exhaustive it stripped her of any illusion that passivity is neutral. She never apologized directly, but 6 months later a package arrived at my office containing a copy of the original HR termination memo with her handwritten note in the margin. I knew this felt wrong. No signature. No letter. Just that sentence. I filed it away and said nothing. Some reckonings don't require witnesses. Thomas Weller voted to retain me during the transition, and then spent the next year becoming the kind of board member he should have been earlier. Guilt can be surprisingly productive in disciplined men. Grant, according to Priya, was trying to rebuild under a new LLC name in Florida. Men like him always believe geography can launder character. Maybe for a little while. My mother called twice. I let both go to voicemail. The first message was formal, almost rehearsed. "Nora, I think enough time has passed for us to speak constructively." The second came 3 weeks later at night, her voice stripped of some of its polish by fatigue. "I miss you. The house is very quiet." That one I listened to once, then archived. Celeste sent a photo one evening of the 2 of us as children in matching red coats outside the Drake Hotel at Christmas, snow caught in our hair, my father kneeling behind us with both arms around our shoulders. No text, just the image. I stared at it for a long time. Then I archived that too. People think ignoring messages is cold. Sometimes it's the warmest thing you can do for yourself. Some doors don't need to be slammed. They just need to stay closed. Not everything from that fire was loss. Lila became something stranger and better than a former witness or ex-employee. She became family in the adult sense of the word. Chosen, observant, dryly funny, the kind of person who notices when your plants need watering and when your voice sounds 1 degree too careful on a Tuesday morning. We developed an easy rhythm built from crisis and honesty. We worked late, ordered Thai food, reviewed engagement letters, while Jazz played softly from the office speaker and the city turned blue outside our windows. Sometimes she'd look up from her laptop and say something so perfectly aimed I'd laugh harder than the joke warranted, mostly because relief has its own appetite. Julian remained in my life too, though at a gentler distance. We were never reckless enough to turn litigation chemistry into romance. Thank God. What survived instead was respect, which ages better. Priya became the kind of friend who sends concise, terrifyingly useful articles at 6:14 a.m. and remembers exactly how you take your tea. When your old life burns down, the people who help you sort the ash often end up holding pieces of your real future. That autumn, 7 months after the confrontation at Whitmore, I was standing on my balcony just after sunset with a glass of white wine in my hand and the city stretching away in ribbons of amber and red. The sky over the rooftops had gone that deep orange that only lasts a few minutes before surrendering to violet. Windows were lighting up one by one across the block. Somewhere nearby, somebody was laughing over dinner. A siren moved faintly in the distance and dissolved into evening. Behind me, my apartment glowed warm against the darkening glass. Soft lamp light on oak shelves. A navy throw folded over the arm of the sofa. Papers neatly stacked on the dining table for Monday's client review. Not grand, not staged, just mine. The buzzer sounded. I let Lila in and opened the door to find her holding a paper bag from a bakery and a bottle of kava. I brought contraband, she said. You mean carbs. I mean closure food. She stepped inside, kicked off her shoes, and headed for the kitchen like she'd been doing it for years. There was something about that simple movement that caught me unexpectedly off guard. Comfort, maybe, or the realization that peace often arrives in ordinary gestures rather than cinematic declarations. We ended up back on the balcony 10 minutes later, each with a slice of almond cake balanced on a napkin and our glasses catching the last of the light. Lila leaned against the railing, city glow painting bronze along the edge of her cheek. You know, she said. When I first started working for Celeste, I thought you hated me. I turned to her. I didn't hate you. You watched me like I was a courier for enemy forces. That's because you were. She laughed, and the sound rose clean into the evening air. Then she got quieter. I was scared to come to you. I know. I kept thinking maybe I'd waited too long. I looked out over the street below, where headlights were beginning to thread through traffic like lit beads on a wire. You came when it mattered. She lifted her glass, slightly. To timing, then. I touched mine to hers. It was a small sound. Barely there. Crystal meeting crystal in orange light. But it felt like the right ceremony. Not dramatic. Not heavy. Just enough. For a while we stood in companionable silence, watching the city move into night. And I thought about the woman I had been before all of this. Not weak. Never that. But untested in a way I had mistaken for safety. I believed that if I worked hard enough, documented enough, anticipated enough, truth would naturally protect me. That families who benefited from your labor would at least respect its source. That being indispensable was a kind of shield. I know better now. Indispensable people are often used hardest because everyone assumes they'll endure it. The difference is, I also know something brighter. Endurance is not the highest form of strength. To some it is. Boundaries are. Strategy is. Learning when to stop offering your honesty to people who treat it like raw material. If I could speak to the younger version of myself, the one sitting at holiday tables smiling through little barbs, the one staying late to fix decks Celeste would later present, the one hearing my mother praise charm and call discipline a personality flaw, I wouldn't tell her to become colder. I'd tell her to become clearer, to notice patterns sooner, to understand that dignity without defense is just an invitation in certain rooms. The strange, almost embarrassing truth is that in the privacy of my own mind, I have thanked them. Not for the betrayal itself. I won't romanticize harm, but for forcing an evolution I might otherwise have delayed for years. My mother taught me what power looks like when it confuses control for love. Celeste taught me what envy looks like when it dresses itself as entitlement. Mark taught me how administrative men hide knives in side processes. And all of them together taught me something invaluable. Truth does not become weaker because liars speak first. Lila broke the silence by nudging the cake box with her foot. Also, for the record, Celeste's showroom name tag, said Celine. I laughed so suddenly I nearly spilled my wine. She changed her name. She shortened it. Of course she did. We stood there smiling into the darkening city like two survivors who had stumbled, against all odds, into a life neither of us would have designed from innocence alone. Below us, the streetlights came on in a line. Above us, the last strip of orange faded from the sky and left the windows around us shining like warm squares cut into night. I raised my glass one final time, not toward the past exactly, but toward the clean distance I had finally built between it and me. I used to think revenge was loud, public, flaming, a slammed door, a ruined speech, a perfect line delivered at the perfect moment while everyone watched the villain finally understand. But that isn't the part that lasts. What lasts is waking up in a life no one can manipulate anymore. What lasts is work with your name on it, peace with locks that hold, love that doesn't require performance, a table where nobody laughs when you speak truth because truth is the reason you're there in the first place. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making people suffer. It's about building a life their lies can't survive in. And if I've learned anything worth keeping, it's this. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making people suffer. It's about becoming someone the truth can finally stand beside.